On the morning of December 7, 1941, radar operators on the Hawaiian island of Oahu detected a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The operators assumed it was a flight of American B-17 bombers expected from the mainland. It wasn't. Within minutes, engines roared over Pearl Harbor, bombs began falling, battleships exploded, airfields burned. American fighters never had the chance to climb. Above the chaos, one aircraft dominated the sky. It climbed higher than every American fighter. It turned tighter, it flew farther, and it seemed almost impossible to shoot down. Pilots who survived the attack described it as graceful, almost effortless. It appeared wherever it wanted, attacked at will, and disappeared before anyone could react. The airplane was officially called the Mitsubishi A6M. The world would simply know it as the Zero. For the first 6 months of the Pacific War, no Allied fighter could consistently defeat it. It conquered the skies from Hawaii to Burma, from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands. It helped Japan build the largest empire in its modern history in less than half a year. But hidden beneath that breathtaking performance was a decision so extreme that most Western engineers considered it reckless. The Zero had been designed to save weight at any cost, even if that cost was the pilot. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no protection against fire. One burst from a machine gun could turn one of the finest fighters ever built into a falling torch. The aircraft that terrified every Allied pilot also terrified the men flying it, because the same engineering decisions that made the Zero nearly unbeatable in combat also meant that when the balance of the war changed, its pilots had almost no chance of coming home. This is the story of the fighter that conquered the Pacific, and the impossible engineering philosophy that eventually destroyed the very force it was built to protect. To understand the Zero, you first have to understand Japan. Unlike Britain, Germany, or the United States, Japan possessed almost none of the natural resources required for modern industrial warfare. Very little oil, very little iron ore, limited aluminum, almost no domestic aviation fuel production. Every war Japan planned to fight would depend on shipping raw materials across thousands of miles of ocean. If those sea lanes were ever cut, Japan's war machine would slowly suffocate. Its military leaders understood this long before the Second World War began. They believed Japan could never win a long war against an industrial giant like the United States. If war came, it had to be decided quickly. Speed would matter more than endurance, aggression more than attrition. The Imperial Japanese Navy embraced this philosophy completely. Every weapon it purchased reflected the same belief: long-range torpedoes, fast carriers, highly trained pilots, aircraft capable of striking before the enemy even knew they were there. The fighter defending those carriers would need to be unlike anything the world had ever seen. During the early 1930s, Japanese naval aviation was already among the best in the world. Carrier operations demanded extraordinary skill. Landing a fighter on a moving ship required precision few pilots anywhere possessed. The Navy expected its aviators to fight far from home, often hundreds of miles from their carriers. Range became everything. A fighter that ran out of fuel over the Pacific simply disappeared forever. Every kilogram mattered. Every unnecessary bolt, every extra sheet of metal, every added kilogram reduced the distance the aircraft could fly. Japanese engineers became obsessed with weight, not reducing it, eliminating it. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued an extraordinary requirement for its next carrier fighter. The specifications seemed impossible. The new aircraft had to exceed 310 miles per hour, climb rapidly, outturn every existing fighter, carry two 20mm cannons alongside machine guns, operate from aircraft carriers, remain airborne for nearly 8 hours with external fuel tanks, and achieve all of this using an engine that produced barely 940 horsepower. To many engineers, the requirements simply didn't add up. The performance demanded belonged to aircraft with far larger engines. Physics appeared to say no. The Navy insisted anyway. Most manufacturers quietly concluded the specification could not be achieved. One company disagreed, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and one engineer believed he knew how. His name was Jiro Horikoshi. Born in 1903 near Tokyo, Horikoshi belonged to the first generation of Japanese engineers raised during aviation's infancy. Unlike many military officers surrounding him, he wasn't obsessed with combat. He was obsessed with airplanes, beautiful airplanes, efficient airplanes, machines that wasted nothing. After graduating from Tokyo Imperial University, he joined Mitsubishi's aircraft division in Nagoya. There, he quickly developed a reputation for solving problems others considered impossible. His earlier fighter designs had shown promise, but suffered from limitations imposed by engines and manufacturing technology. Now, the Navy had given him something different, an impossible list. Horikoshi later admitted his first reaction was simple disbelief. The aircraft the Navy wanted could not exist, not using existing engineering methods. If the performance targets were to be achieved, the entire design philosophy would have to change. Most military aircraft of the late 1930s followed similar principles. Build a strong structure, protect the pilot, accept additional weight, install the most powerful engine available. Horikoshi reversed the order completely. Weight became the enemy. Everything else became secondary. Every kilogram removed increased climb rate, increased speed, improved turning performance, extended range. Removing weight produced multiple advantages simultaneously. It was the closest thing aviation had to free performance, but eventually there was nothing left to remove except protection. That was the line Horikoshi found himself approaching. Fortunately, Japanese metallurgy had recently produced something remarkable. A new aluminum alloy known as Extra Super Duralumine. Developed specifically for aviation, it possessed significantly greater strength than conventional aluminum while remaining exceptionally light. Used correctly, it allowed thinner structural members without sacrificing rigidity. For Horikoshi, it was exactly the breakthrough he needed. The Zero's internal structure became astonishingly light. Its wings were incredibly thin. Its fuselage was compact. Even individual brackets and fittings were redesigned to remove every unnecessary gram. Engineers drilled lightning holes into structural components wherever strength calculations permitted. If a part could be made smaller, it was. If it could be removed entirely, even better. The obsession bordered on fanaticism. The engine presented another challenge. Japan simply lacked engines comparable to the newest British or American designs. Instead of demanding more horsepower, Horikoshi designed an aircraft that required less. The Mitsubishi prototype would use the Nakajima Sakai radial engine. Reliable, compact, but producing only around 940 horsepower initially, far less than many foreign contemporaries. On paper, the fighter should have been slower than its rivals. Instead, it became faster, not because of raw power, because almost nothing was wasted overcoming unnecessary weight. The wings became another masterpiece. Long, exceptionally efficient, designed to generate enormous lift at relatively low speeds. That gave carrier pilots safer landings. It also produced breathtaking maneuverability. The aircraft could sustain turns that many foreign fighters simply couldn't match. American pilots would later learn a painful lesson. Trying to outturn a Zero almost always ended badly. The Japanese fighter had been designed specifically for exactly that type of combat. Its controls remained light even at moderate speeds. It almost seemed to dance through the sky. Veteran pilots described it as an extension of the human body rather than a machine. Few aircraft have ever received greater praise from the people who flew them. Then came the armament. Most fighters of the late 1930s relied primarily on rifle-caliber machine guns. The Zero carried something much heavier, two Type 99 20mm cannons mounted in the wings, two additional 7.7mm machine guns above the engine. Against bombers, the cannons were devastating. Against fighters, even a handful of hits could destroy an aircraft. The Zero combined exceptional maneuverability with genuine striking power. It wasn't merely agile, it was lethal. But every new feature added weight. Every weapon, every round of ammunition, every litre of fuel, something else had to disappear. Horikoshi faced decisions no engineer wanted to make. Should the pilot receive armour behind his seat? That meant extra weight. Should the fuel tanks seal themselves after being punctured? That meant even more weight. Should the structure be reinforced to improve survivability? Again, more weight. Every kilogram sacrificed the very performance that made the aircraft possible. The Navy made its priorities clear. Performance came first. Everything else came second, including survival. The final design omitted pilot armour. It omitted self-sealing fuel tanks. It omitted virtually every feature Western designers increasingly considered essential. The Zero would not survive damage. Its strategy was far simpler. Don't get hit. The first prototype flew on April 1st, 1939. Almost immediately, test pilots realized they were flying something extraordinary. The aircraft climbed effortlessly. Its controls felt perfectly balanced. Visibility from the cockpit was outstanding. Most astonishing of all, its range exceeded anything anyone thought possible for a carrier fighter. It could escort bombers hundreds of miles from its carrier, fight enemy aircraft, and still return safely. No fighter in the world could match that combination of speed, agility, firepower, and endurance. The Imperial Japanese Navy immediately recognized what Horikoshi had accomplished. They had not simply received a new fighter. They had received the aircraft around which an entire naval air strategy could be built. Production orders followed almost immediately. Within 2 years, the Zero would enter combat, and for a brief moment in history, it would become the most feared fighter on Earth. But the very philosophy that made it nearly unbeatable contained a flaw that no victory could hide forever. The prototype first flew on April 1st, 1939. At first glance, it looked almost fragile. Its wings were impossibly thin. Its landing gear retracted cleanly into the fuselage. The nose was narrow. The canopy was smooth. Every line served one purpose: reducing drag. The aircraft was powered by Mitsubishi's new Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine, producing around 940 horsepower. On paper, that did not sound extraordinary. British Hurricanes already approached similar power. German Messerschmitt Bf 109s had comparable engines. What made the Zero extraordinary was not horsepower, it was weight. Fully loaded, the prototype weighed barely over 5,000 pounds. The Spitfire weighed significantly more. The Hurricane was heavier still. Every kilogram Horikoshi removed translated directly into climb rate, turning performance and range. During testing, Japanese Navy pilots were stunned. The aircraft climbed faster than anything they had flown. It rolled effortlessly. It could perform complete 360-degree turns in roughly 12 seconds. It remained controllable at incredibly low speeds. Most importantly, it could outturn every known foreign fighter. Veteran pilots described it as feeling almost alive. The controls required little effort. Tiny stick movements translated into immediate responses. The airplane seemed to anticipate the pilot's intentions. Years later, Allied test pilots would describe the same sensation. One American pilot said flying the Zero felt less like controlling an airplane and more like wearing wings. The Navy immediately recognized its potential. After additional testing and small modifications, the aircraft entered production as the Mitsubishi A6M Navy Type Zero carrier fighter. The Type Zero designation came from the Japanese imperial calendar. The aircraft entered service in the year 2600. Western intelligence shortened the name to something much simpler: the Zero. Few names in aviation history would become so famous, or so feared. Its first real test came not over Pearl Harbor, but over China. In mid-1940, Zeros deployed to occupied airfields and immediately encountered Chinese fighters, many flown by volunteer American and Soviet pilots. The results were astonishing. Older Chinese aircraft simply could not compete. Pilots attempting to dogfight the Zero found themselves outturned within seconds. Aircraft trying to outrun it discovered the Japanese fighter possessed remarkable speed for its size. Those attempting to climb away quickly learned the Zero climbed almost effortlessly. Combat reports returned to Tokyo describing an aircraft unlike anything seen before. Losses were minimal. Victories mounted rapidly. Many Japanese pilots became convinced they were flying the greatest fighter ever built. That confidence would soon spread across the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched over 350 aircraft toward Pearl Harbor. Among them were 43 Mitsubishi Zeros. Their mission was straightforward: destroy American fighters before they could leave the ground. The Zero excelled at exactly this kind of work: fast enough to intercept, agile enough to dominate dogfights, armed with two 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns capable of shredding lightly armoured aircraft in seconds. American pilots scrambled desperately. Most never had a chance. Aircraft burned on runways. Hangars exploded. Within hours, the Pacific Fleet lay crippled. Although torpedo bombers received most of the attention, the Zero had secured complete air superiority over Hawaii. For many Americans, it was the first time they encountered Japan's mysterious new fighter. It would not be the last. Over the next 6 months, the Zero carved a path across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, unlike anything the Allies had experienced. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. Island after island fell. Again and again, Allied pilots entered combat believing their aircraft could compete. Again and again, they discovered they were wrong. British Brewster Buffaloes stood little chance. American P-40 Warhawks were faster in a dive, but hopeless in turning combat. Dutch fighters disappeared from the skies. Australian squadrons suffered heavy losses. Even experienced Royal Air Force veterans found themselves shocked. The rules they had learned in Europe no longer worked. Dogfight the Zero. And you died. Many Allied pilots never understood why. From their cockpit, the Japanese fighter seemed almost supernatural. It climbed vertically. It turned inside every maneuver. It appeared wherever it was least expected. Stories spread through Allied air forces describing impossible feats. Pilots claimed the Zero could turn on its own wingtip. Some insisted it could hang motionless in the air. Others believed it possessed secret technology. None of that was true. The explanation was actually much simpler. The Zero had been designed without compromise. Or more accurately, it had been designed with one enormous compromise nobody fully understood yet. Japanese pilots themselves became legends. Many had trained for years before entering combat. Imperial Navy flight training was among the most demanding programs in the world. Only a tiny percentage graduated. Those who did accumulated hundreds of flying hours before ever seeing combat. Many Allied pilots entering battle in 1942 possessed fewer than 200 total flight hours. Some Japanese aces had over 800. Combined with the Zero's incredible agility, the result was devastating. One pilot in particular embodied this advantage: Saburo Sakai. Already an experienced combat veteran from China, Sakai quickly became one of Japan's highest scoring aces. He routinely engaged multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously. During one mission, despite suffering a severe head wound that partially blinded him, he managed to fly his damaged Zero hundreds of miles back to base. Stories like his helped build the Zero's almost mythical reputation. But myths often hide uncomfortable truths. Even Sakai would later admit the airplane had weaknesses. Weaknesses few people noticed while Japan kept winning. The victories created a dangerous illusion. Inside Tokyo, inside Mitsubishi, inside naval headquarters. Many officers concluded they had solved fighter design. If the Zero could defeat every opponent in 1942, why change it? Production accelerated. Factories worked around the clock. More carriers received new aircraft. More pilots entered combat, convinced they were invincible. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American engineers were studying every combat report they could obtain. Pilots who survived encounters with the Zero described the same patterns. Never turn with it. Dive away. Use speed. Attack from above. Keep moving. At first, these lessons remained scattered observations. Soon, they would become doctrine. Even more importantly, the Americans were about to acquire something far more valuable than combat reports. They were about to capture an almost perfectly intact Zero. And when engineers finally examined the airplane up close, they discovered the secret that explained both its breathtaking success and why it was already becoming obsolete. The airplane that changed the Pacific War did not fall in battle. It landed. On June 4, 1942, during the Aleutian Islands campaign, a Japanese Zero piloted by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga was hit by American anti-aircraft fire over Akutan Island in Alaska. The damage appeared minor. Koga attempted an emergency landing in what looked like a flat, grassy field. It wasn't. The ground was actually a hidden marsh. The landing gear dug into the soft earth. The Zero flipped violently onto its back. Koga was killed instantly. The airplane remained almost perfectly intact. For weeks, nobody found it. Then an American reconnaissance crew spotted the wreck. When engineers arrived, they realized they were looking at something priceless. For the first time since the war began, the Allies possessed an almost undamaged Mitsubishi Zero. The airplane was carefully recovered, shipped to the United States, rebuilt, and then flown. What American test pilots discovered would change every air battle that followed. The Zero was everything the combat reports had claimed. It climbed exceptionally well. Its controls were astonishingly light. Its turning radius was unlike anything in the Allied inventory. At low speeds, it was almost unbeatable, but every strength came from a design decision, and every design decision carried a price. The engineers began taking the airplane apart. They measured every component, every spar, every bulkhead, every rivet. The findings shocked them. The wing structure was incredibly thin. Protective armour was almost non-existent. The cockpit offered virtually no protection. Most astonishing of all, the fuel tanks had no self-sealing liners. That single omission explained everything. American and British fighters carried rubber-lined fuel tanks that automatically swelled when pierced by bullets. Fuel leaks often sealed themselves before igniting. Horikoshi had removed those liners. They were too heavy. The Zero carried more fuel than almost any fighter in the world. But if that fuel caught fire, there was almost nothing to stop it. One burst from American .50 caliber machine guns could turn the aircraft into a flying torch. The pilot had nowhere to hide, no armour behind his seat, no armoured windscreen, no steel plates protecting his head. The Zero had become the world's greatest dogfighter by sacrificing almost everything designed to keep its pilot alive. The airplane wasn't built around survival, it was built around victory. There is a difference, and eventually, that difference became fatal. American instructors immediately rewrote their training manuals. The advice was simple: never turn with a Zero, ever. Instead, use altitude, use speed, attack once, then climb away. If a Zero followed into a dive, its light structure began working against it. The controls stiffened dramatically at high speeds. Compressibility made recovery difficult. American fighters like the P-38 Lightning and later the P-47 Thunderbolt could simply dive away. The Zero could rarely follow safely. The legendary Thak Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thak, became one of the war's defining defensive tactics. Two American fighters flew in parallel. When attacked, they turned toward each other, forcing the pursuing Zero into the guns of the second aircraft. Simple, disciplined, deadly. The tactic exploited the one thing Japanese pilots increasingly lacked: protection, even when a Zero gained the advantage. One burst from American .50 caliber machine guns could destroy it. Then came Midway, June 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sailed east, hoping to destroy America's remaining naval strength. Instead, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered one of the greatest defeats in military history. Within hours, 4 carriers burned. Hundreds of experienced pilots were lost. Many could never be replaced. The ships mattered, the airplanes mattered, but the pilots mattered most. Japan had created one of the most demanding naval aviation training systems in the world. Producing a carrier pilot required years. Replacing one required years. Losing hundreds in a single battle created a wound that never healed. The Zero itself remained excellent, but increasingly, it was being flown by men with less experience. The Americans had the opposite problem. Early in the war, their fighters had often been inferior. By 1943, that had changed. Factories across the United States were producing aircraft at an industrial scale Japan simply could not match. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service. It had been designed almost entirely around defeating the Zero. Its engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice the power of the early Sakai engine. It was faster, better protected, heavily armoured. Its fuel tanks self-sealed. Its 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Most importantly, it could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero instantly. Pilots joked that you could bring a Hellcat home with half the airplane missing. Nobody said that about the Zero. Soon after came the Vought F4U Corsair. Initially difficult to land on carriers, it found success operating from island airfields. With its massive engine and distinctive bent wings, it could outrun, outclimb and outgun nearly every Japanese fighter it encountered. American engineers had learned. They had not tried to outturn the Zero. They had built airplanes that refused to play by the Zero's rules. Horikoshi watched these developments with growing frustration. He knew the Zero needed improvement. He proposed stronger engines, better armour, self-sealing fuel tanks, structural reinforcement. But every improvement added weight. Every kilogram reduced the manoeuvrability that had made the Zero famous. The Imperial Navy remained obsessed with agility, even as Allied aircraft became faster, tougher and more powerful. Japanese leadership continued demanding extreme manoeuvrability above almost everything else. New versions appeared: the A6M3, the A6M5. They increased speed, improved diving performance, strengthened the wings. But the fundamental philosophy never changed. The Zero remained light and vulnerable. Meanwhile, American aviation evolved at breathtaking speed. Radar improved interception. Carrier tactics matured. Pilot training expanded enormously. Perhaps most importantly, American industry overwhelmed Japan through sheer numbers. In 1944 alone, the United States built more military aircraft than Japan would produce during much of the entire war. No engineering miracle could overcome that imbalance. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 became known by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The nickname sounded cruel. The reality was worse. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft attacked the American fleet. Many were flying Zeros. Many were flown by inexperienced pilots. Radar detected them long before they arrived. American fighters intercepted them while still far from the fleet. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed. American losses remained comparatively tiny. It was no longer a contest between equals. The Zero that had terrified Allied pilots in 1942 had become hopelessly outmatched, not because it had suddenly become a bad airplane, but because the world around it had changed. Yet one final tragedy remained. As Japan's military situation collapsed, the Zero found a new role, one Horikoshi had never intended, one no engineer ever wants his creation to perform. Beginning in late 1944, Japan organized the first large-scale kamikaze attacks. Special attack units loaded Zeros with bombs. Pilots received enough fuel for a one-way mission. Their target was simple: crash directly into Allied warships. The Zero's excellent range made it ideal. Its agility helped pilots evade anti-aircraft fire until the final seconds. Thousands of young men climbed into aircraft they knew they would never land. Many were barely trained. Some had only recently earned their wings. The airplane built to achieve air superiority became a guided missile. Its greatest strength, its long range, now ensured its pilots could reach their own deaths. The aircraft that had sacrificed pilot protection for performance was now sacrificing the pilot entirely. And for Horikoshi, that was perhaps the cruelest irony of all, because while the Zero had been designed to win Japan's wars, it had ultimately become the symbol of how Japan was losing them. By the summer of 1945, the Mitsubishi Zero no longer ruled the skies. The fighter that had swept across the Pacific in the first months of the war was now hopelessly outclassed. American Hellcats, Corsairs, Mustangs, even late-war British fighters, all were faster, more powerful, better protected. The Zero could still turn tighter than almost any opponent. But air combat had changed. Speed mattered more than turning. Firepower mattered more than agility. Survivability mattered more than elegance. The design philosophy that had made the Zero unbeatable in 1941 had become a liability by 1945. And no amount of pilot skill could overcome physics. Japan desperately searched for replacements. Mitsubishi developed newer fighters. Nakajima introduced the Ka-84 Hayate. Kawanishi built the exceptional N1K2J Shiden Kai. On paper, these aircraft could challenge Allied fighters. Some were arguably among the finest piston engine fighters of the entire war. But they arrived too late. Japan no longer possessed the fuel to train enough pilots. Factories struggled under constant bombing. Raw materials became scarce. Engines suffered from poor quality control. Even excellent designs could not reverse a collapsing industrial base. The Zero remained in production because Japan had little choice. More than 10,000 would ultimately be built. It became the most produced Japanese fighter aircraft of the Second World War. Yet by the final months of the conflict, many of those aircraft were no longer being used as fighters. They were flying one-way missions. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. For millions, it brought relief. For Jiro Horikoshi, it brought something more complicated. He had spent years creating what he believed was the finest aircraft he could possibly design. His goal had never been conquest. It had never been politics. He simply wanted to build beautiful airplanes. Instead, his masterpiece had become one of the most recognizable weapons of the war. Later in life, Horikoshi spoke openly about this conflict. He described himself first as an engineer, someone fascinated by flight, someone who admired aircraft regardless of which nation built them. He studied the work of British, American, German, and Italian designers with equal respect. His dream had always been to push aviation forward. History had pulled that dream into war. After Japan's defeat, Allied investigators carefully examined captured Zeros. Many were surprised by what they found. The aircraft was not built with magical technology. Its metallurgy was excellent. Its aerodynamics were brilliant. Its engineering was meticulous. But there was no secret weapon, no revolutionary engine, no hidden innovation decades ahead of its time. The Zero succeeded because Horikoshi had made a series of ruthless decisions. Every unnecessary kilogram disappeared. Every feature that did not directly improve performance was questioned, sometimes eliminated entirely. It was an engineering masterpiece precisely because it was uncompromising. And that was also why it became obsolete. As engines grew more powerful and opponents became faster, aircraft could finally afford armour, stronger structures and self-sealing fuel tanks without giving up performance. The Zero could not. Its greatest strength had become its greatest weakness. There is a lesson hidden inside its story. Engineering is always a series of trade-offs. Nothing comes for free. More speed often means less endurance. More armour usually means more weight. More firepower demands a stronger airframe. Every designer chooses which compromises to make. Horikoshi chose performance. And for 2 extraordinary years, he was right. The Zero dominated the Pacific because no other fighter balanced range, maneuverability, and simplicity so perfectly. But war evolves. An airplane designed to win today's battles may lose tomorrow's. Technology never stands still. The moment you stop adapting, your advantage begins to disappear. Today, only a handful of original Mitsubishi Zeros remain airworthy. Some sit silently in museums across Japan, the United States, Australia and Europe. Others fly occasionally at carefully managed air shows. Their engines still produce the same distinctive sound that once echoed over Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal and countless Pacific islands. For aviation enthusiasts, they are masterpieces of engineering. For veterans, they are reminders of terrible battles. For historians, they represent one of the clearest examples of how brilliant design can both create victory and guarantee future defeat. Few aircraft have changed a war so quickly. Even fewer have revealed the limits of engineering so clearly. Jiro Horikoshi once wrote that all he ever wanted was to create an airplane that was beautiful. He succeeded. The Mitsubishi Zero was beautiful, it was elegant, it was revolutionary, it was terrifying. And ultimately, it was tragic. Because the same decisions that made it the deadliest fighter in the Pacific also ensured that its pilots had almost no chance once the balance of the war shifted. The Zero wasn't simply built to win. It was designed around the belief that victory mattered more than survival. For a brief moment, that philosophy conquered half the Pacific. In the end, it consumed the very men it was meant to protect. That is why the Mitsubishi Zero remains one of history's greatest aircraft. Not because it was perfect, but because no other fighter demonstrates so clearly that every engineering decision has a price. Sometimes, that price is paid by the people inside the machine. If you enjoyed this story, do not forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the aircraft, engineers, and decisions that shaped military history. And if there is another legendary aircraft you would like to see covered next, let me know in the comments.